They were still laughing when she reached the hallway. She could hear them through the closed dining room doors, not the sharp, deliberate laughter of people who wanted to wound, which would have been easier to bear, but the loose, careless laughter of people who had already forgotten her. That was the particular cruelty of it. She had not even been worth remembering for the length of a corridor. She kept her back straight. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands still at her sides, which was the hardest part, because her hands always wanted to do something when the rest of her was not allowed to. The footman at the door did not meet her eyes. He had heard. Of course he had heard. In houses like this, the staff heard everything and said nothing and looked at the floor when the occasion required it, and this was apparently such an occasion. She thanked him anyway. She stepped out into the cold. The carriage was waiting at the end of the drive, her father's old carriage with the worn step and the door that stuck in the rain, and she walked toward it with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and was simply on her way there. She climbed in. The door closed. The carriage moved. She waited until they had cleared the gates, until the lights of Ashford Hall had disappeared behind the tree line, and there was nothing outside the window but dark road and darker fields. And then, and only then, she let her hands unclench. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people only gave them something else to laugh at. She saved it for the carriage. She always saved it for the carriage. This time, however, something was different. Halfway home, somewhere on the dark road between Ashford Hall and everything she was going back to, the tears stopped, not because she had finished, but because something else had arrived. Something quieter and more deliberate than grief. A decision. She was never going back. She sat with that for the rest of the journey, turned it over, examined it from every angle, found it solid. By the time the carriage stopped at her door, she had dried her face, straightened her gloves, and made up her mind entirely. She did not know, stepping out into the cold night air, that a footman was already crossing the drive behind her. She did not know he was carrying a note. She did not know whose seal was on it. It had begun, as these things often do, with the best of intentions and the worst of timing. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday stiff cream paper, the Ashford crest pressed into dark wax, her name written in a secretary's careful hand. Miss Margaret Holloway, dinner, Friday, 8 o'clock, no explanation, no context, just the summons as though the reason for it were self-evident and she ought to simply present herself and be grateful. Her father had been delighted. Margaret had been suspicious. The Ashford and Holloway families had not been on easy terms for years, something to do with the boundary of the eastern field, a dispute that had outlasted 2 solicitors and a considerable amount of ill will on both sides. An invitation to dinner was not, in Margaret's experience, how such disputes resolved themselves. It was, however, how they got complicated. "He wants to settle it," her father had said, rubbing his hands together in a way that Margaret associated with decisions she was going to regret. Face to face, man to man, well, a brief pause, man to family. "He invited me," Margaret had said, "not you. You represent the family." "I represent myself," Margaret had said, "which is not the same thing." Her father had given her the look he reserved for observations he found inconvenient, a slight compression of the lips, a brief redirection of attention to something across the room, and said nothing further. She had gone, not because she was persuaded, but because the alternative was letting her father go in her place, and her father had the diplomatic instincts of a man who believed that enthusiasm could substitute for strategy. The dress had been her mother's. That was the thing nobody in that dining room had known, and that Margaret had known with every breath she took from the moment she put it on. Her mother had worn it to the Cavendish ball in 1809, the year before Margaret was born, and it had been fashionable then, genuinely, properly fashionable, not fashionable in the way of women who lived too far from London to know the difference. It was not fashionable now. Margaret knew that. She had known it putting it on. She had stood in front of the glass in her room and looked at herself with the clear, unflinching assessment of a woman who had been making do for long enough to know exactly what making do looked like, and she had thought, "It's clean. It fits. It's the best I have." She had decided that was enough. It had not been enough. She had understood this the moment she walked into the Ashford dining room and saw the other women, 3 of them Londoners, draped in silks that had been made this season and possibly last week, their shoulders bare, their jewels current, their eyes moving over her with the swift and merciless efficiency of people who categorize on instinct. The categorization had taken perhaps 4 seconds. She had been placed, she understood, somewhere below the threshold of serious consideration. Not a threat, not a prospect, not even quite a person deserving of direct acknowledgement, just a provincial in an old dress who had wandered into the wrong room. She had taken her seat. She had unfolded her napkin. She had decided that she was going to eat her dinner and say nothing foolish and leave with her dignity intact, which was a modest enough ambition, and one she had thought achievable. The Duke of Ashford sat at the head of the table. Margaret had seen him before twice, at county functions, across enough distance that she had formed no particular impression beyond the general outline of a tall, dark-haired man, with the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. Up close he was more defined than that, sharper, quieter, with the kind of face that gave nothing away unless it chose to. He had acknowledged her arrival with a nod, courteous, brief, the nod of a host checking off an expected arrival. Then he had turned to the woman on his left, one of the Londoners, dark-eyed and elegant, and the conversation had moved on, and Margaret had been, efficiently and without malice, set aside. She had eaten her soup. The laughter had begun with the fish course. She had not heard what started it, a comment from the woman across the table, something murmured behind a gloved hand, a remark that traveled down the table in pieces before it arrived at her end hole. But she had heard the result, which was 3 women laughing with the particular ease of people who laughed at things that belonged to other people, and therefore cost them nothing. And she had looked up briefly, and across the candles and the crystal and the careful flower arrangements she had met the Duke's eyes. He had been looking at her, not laughing, not joining, just watching. She had held his gaze for 1 second, 2. He had looked away first. He had said nothing. That was the whole of it. Not cruelty, she could have survived cruelty. Cruelty had edges you could push against. Just silence. The silence of a man who had weighed the cost of speaking and found something else more pressing. She had set down her fork. She had picked it up again. She had finished every course. The note was waiting when she stepped out of the carriage. Her father's housemaid was on the step, which was unusual at this hour, and beside her a young man in Ashford livery, holding a sealed note with the careful expression of someone who had been told to wait until it was delivered personally. Margaret took it. She looked at the seal, the Ashford crest, dark wax, pressed with the signet ring she had noticed on the Duke's hand at dinner. She broke it. Inside, in a hand that was not a secretary's, decisive, slightly impatient, the handwriting of a man who wrote quickly and meant what he wrote, were 5 words: "I owe you an apology," and below that a signature, "James Ashford." Margaret stood on the step in the cold night air and read it twice. Then she folded it with great care and put it in her pocket. She did not send the boy back with a reply. She went inside. She hung up her mother's dress. She sat on the edge of her bed and thought about a man who had watched in silence and then written 5 words in his own hand as she checked the clock 10:30 on a Friday night. She thought about what 5 words cost a duke. She thought about what his silence had cost her. She decided they were not, at present, equivalent. She went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well, but she did not cry again either, which felt, in its own small way, like a victory. He came the next morning. Margaret was in the garden when she heard the horse, not the sound of her father's old mare, which she knew by its particular unhurried plod, but something faster and more deliberate, the sound of an animal that had been ridden with purpose. She looked up from the rose bed she had been attending to with more concentration than it strictly required, and saw the Ashford crest on the saddle before she saw the man. She straightened. She did not remove her gardening gloves. The Duke of Ashford dismounted at the gate with the ease of a man who had been on horseback since childhood and had never needed to think about it. He was not in the formal clothes of the previous evening, riding coat, plain dark, no ceremony to it, which meant he had come directly without preparation, which meant he had decided to come before he had time to talk himself out of it. Margaret noted this without softening. He saw her across the garden. He came through the gate. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Your Grace." She did not curtsy. She was in a garden in the morning in her working gloves, and curtsying under these circumstances seemed like a concession she had not agreed to make. He did not appear to expect one. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with the same direct, unguarded attention he had fixed on her at dinner, the look she had not known what to do with then, and did not know what to do with now. "I came to apologize," he said. "I received your note," Margaret said. "A note is not an apology." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He absorbed this without visible reaction. "Then I should have stopped them." "Yes." "I didn't." "No." A pause. A bird somewhere in the garden started up and then thought better of it. "Is there a reason," Margaret said, "or only an explanation?" He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not offense, not the faint aristocratic surprise of a man unaccustomed to being questioned, something more honest than either. The look of a man who had been asked a fair question and was deciding whether to give a fair answer. "There was someone at the table," he said. "I was trying to impress. It was foolish. It lasted approximately 30 seconds before I understood how foolish it was, at which point you were already leaving." Margaret looked at him steadily. "You watched me leave," she said. "Yes." "And said nothing then either?" "No." "So the 30 seconds passed," she said, "and you understood it was foolish, and you watched me walk out of your dining room and you still said nothing." He did not look away. "Yes." "That," Margaret said, pulling off one gardening glove with a precise, unhurried movement, "is not a reason. That is simply a longer explanation." She turned back to the rose bed. Behind her, silence. Then, "You're right." She stopped, did not turn. "I have no reason," he said. "Only the fact of it, and the fact that I am sorry, and the fact that sorry is insufficient. I know that." A pause. "I came anyway." Margaret stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she turned. He was still there. He had the look of a man who had prepared several versions of this conversation, and found that none of them had been necessary, because she had taken it somewhere none of them had anticipated. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was even, not warm, not cold, the voice of a woman who was being precise. "I heard what you said. I believe you mean it." She held his gaze. "But you watched, Your Grace. You sat at the head of your table and you watched, and that is the whole of it. A note and a morning visit don't change what the watching was." She went inside. Her father met her in the hallway. He had been at the window, she could tell by the angle he was standing at. Slightly too casual, slightly too far from where he would naturally be at this hour. And his expression had the particular quality of a man assembling an attitude in a hurry. "The Duke of Ashford," he said, "in our garden." "He came to apologize," Margaret said, hanging her gloves on the hook by the door. To apologize. Her father said it the way he said things he found improbable. Ashford came to apologize. "Yes." "What did you say?" "I thanked him and came inside." Her father stared at her. "Margaret." "I'm going to wash my hands," she said. "Is there tea?" "There is tea," her father said, with the baffled resignation of a man who had learned over many years that Margaret in this particular mood was not a thing to be steered. "There is tea." She thought about it that afternoon. Not about the Duke, or not only about him. About the night itself. about the specific architecture of what had happened, which she had been turning over since the carriage, examining from different angles the way you examine a piece of furniture you are considering buying. This joint here, this grain there, where does it hold and where does it give? The women had laughed. That was the surface of it, the visible part, the part that had required the carriage and the dark road and the decision. But beneath that, the Duke's silence, and beneath that, her father's eagerness. The way he had said man to family and looked at her as though she were a piece to be moved rather than a person to be consulted. And beneath that, the question she had not let herself ask yet, because she had been too busy being dignified. Why had she been invited at all? Not for the Arazi dispute. That could have been handled by solicitors, had been handled by solicitors badly and expensively for 3 years. A dinner invitation was not how you resolved a boundary dispute. A dinner invitation was how you resolved something else. She sat with that for a while. She did not arrive at a comfortable conclusion. The second note came on Monday. Not 5 words this time. A full page in the same decisive hand, and she sat at the window in the morning light and read it with the careful attention she gave things that were going to require a response. It was about the Eastern Field. He wrote, reviewed the original boundary agreement, the one drawn up between their fathers 15 years ago, and had found certain irregularities. He used that word, irregularities, a lawyer's word chosen deliberately. He did not elaborate on the irregularities. He simply stated that they existed, that he intended to have them examined properly, and that he wanted her to know before he proceeded. I thought you should hear it from me directly, he wrote, rather than through solicitors, which is how things in this particular matter have gone wrong before. Margaret read it twice. Then she read the last line again. I thought you should hear it from me directly. She put the letter down. She picked it up. She went to find her father. He was in his study, which was where he spent his mornings, nominally doing accounts and actually reading agricultural journals and occasionally doing accounts. He looked up when she came in with the expression of a man interrupted mid-avoidance. She put the letter on his desk. He looked at it, at the Ashford seal, at her face. What is this? He said. A letter from the Duke, she said, about the Eastern Field. He says there are irregularities in the original boundary agreement. She watched her father's face. He says he found them when he reviewed it. Her father picked up the letter. He read it. His expression did not change in the way of a man reading something surprising. It changed in the way of a man reading something he had been expecting and had hoped would not arrive yet. Margaret saw it. Father, she said. It's nothing, he said, too quickly. These things are always small. Father, he put the letter down. He did not look at her. Outside the window, the Eastern Field lay flat and brown in the November light, exactly where it had always been, belonging to exactly who it had always belonged to, which Margaret had always assumed was them. How long, she said quietly, have you known? The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own answer. Margaret sat down in the chair across from his desk, the chair she had sat in her whole life, asking questions and receiving careful partial answers, and looked at her father and understood, with the slow and total clarity of something becoming undeniable, that the ground beneath this particular conversation was not solid. Tell me, she said, all of it. Her father looked at his hands. He told her. It took 20 minutes. When he finished, the room was very quiet. The Eastern Field was still visible through the window. Margaret looked at it for a long time. Then she stood up, took the Duke's letter from the desk, and went upstairs to write a reply. It was the shortest letter she had ever written. Ask my father what he already receives, your grace. She sealed it. She sent it. Then she sat in her room and listened to the house settle around her and thought about a man who had sent 2 notes in 3 days, and a father who had been quiet for 15 years, and a dinner she had attended in her mother's dress because it was the best she had. She thought about what the field was worth. She thought about what the silence had cost. She thought, for the first time, that perhaps they were not unrelated. London was exactly as James had left it. That was the problem with London. It was always exactly as you left it. The same drawing rooms, the same faces arranged around the same tables making the same observations about the same people. The whole machinery of the season turning with the reliable indifference of something that did not require your participation to continue functioning. He had come back because there was business. There was always business. His solicitor was here. His bank was here. 3 matters requiring his signature were here. And so he had come, and he had attended the requisite dinners, and he had sat in his club reading letters he had already read and staring at the fire with the focused attention of a man thinking about something that had nothing to do with the fire. He was thinking about a woman standing in a garden in the morning with gardening gloves on, telling him that a note and a morning visit didn't change what the watching was. He had thought about it in the carriage back to London. He had thought about it at his solicitor's office, at a particularly tedious luncheon, at 2:30 in the morning when sleep had declined to arrive. He had turned it over the way you turn over something that has lodged in a place that resists easy extraction, not painfully exactly, but with the persistent low-grade awareness of something that is still there. You watched, Your Grace. That is the whole of it. He was not accustomed to being told the whole of things. People said partial things to him, carefully edited, socially calibrated, shaped to land well. They told him what they thought he wanted to hear, or what they thought was safe to say, or what they thought would serve them best. It was not malice, exactly. It was simply the way people spoke to dukes, and he had grown so accustomed to it that he had largely stopped noticing. He had noticed Miss Holloway. He poured himself another glass and looked at the fire. The letter had arrived on his 3rd day in London. He had recognized the handwriting, or rather, he had recognized that he did not recognize it, which narrowed the possibilities considerably. He broke the seal. Ask my father what he already receives, Your Grace. He read it 3 times. Then he set it down and looked at it from a slight distance, as though perspective might clarify what closeness had not. What he already receives. He called for his estate manager. It took 4 days to find. Not because it was hidden. It was not particularly hidden, which suggested either carelessness or confidence, and he suspected the latter. It was simply filed in the way of things that were not expected to be examined. Quarterly entries, modest amounts, recorded under a category that was technically accurate and practically misleading. Payments to Holloway, quarterly. Beginning 15 years ago, the year after the boundary dispute had begun, and 2 years before it had been formally submitted to solicitors. Regular as rent, small enough to be unremarkable, large enough, accumulated over 15 years to be significant. James sat with the ledger open in front of him, and thought about a boundary dispute that had lasted 3 years in the hands of solicitors, and had never resolved, because resolution was not what it had been designed for. He thought about an invitation to dinner. His own invitation, sent because his solicitor had suggested a direct approach, because the legal avenue was going nowhere, because sometimes these things were better handled face to face. He thought about a father who had sent his daughter in his place. He thought about a daughter who had arrived in her mother's dress because it was the best she had, and sat at his table and been laughed at, and walked out with her back straight, and saved the crying for the carriage. Who had not known? He was certain of that. He had been uncertain of many things in the past 2 weeks, but he was certain of that she had not known. The letter proved it. Ask my father. Not I know what my father receives. Not you and my father have an arrangement. Just ask him. The blunt, direct instruction of someone pointing a finger at something they have just discovered and have not yet had time to be careful about. She had found out. And the first thing she had done was tell him. He closed the ledger. He thought about her sitting across from him at that dinner placed, by his own seating arrangement, near the foot of the table, between 2 people who had spent the evening talking across her rather than to her. He thought about the moment the laughter had started, the way it had traveled down the table, The way he had heard it and looked up and met her eyes. He had looked away first. He pressed his fingers briefly to his eyes. He had been trying that evening to appear indifferent to a woman 3 seats to his left, a woman he had once been briefly, foolishly attached to, who had married someone else and appeared to enjoy knowing it, and toward whom he had behaved, he could see clearly now, with the transparent pride of a man performing unconcern. He had laughed too readily. He had leaned back in his chair with the practiced ease of someone demonstrating that they were entirely at ease. He had, when the laughter began, made the calculation, one terrible, swift, small calculation. That intervening would look like caring and caring, would look like weakness and weakness, was not something he was willing to show in that particular room on that particular evening. He had traded Margaret Holloway's dignity for the performance of indifference to a woman whose opinion he did not actually value. He had understood it was foolish within 30 seconds. He had said nothing for far longer than 30 seconds. You watched, Your Grace. That is the whole of it. Yes, that was the whole of it. She had named it precisely, and he had stood in her garden and received the naming and had not been able to argue with a single word of it. He picked up the letter again. Ask my father what he already receives. He was going to have to go back. He found the answer before he went. Not from Holloway Sr., he had not yet spoken to him directly, had instead instructed his estate manager to make discreet inquiries, gather what was gatherable before any conversation that would put Holloway on his guard. What came back was straightforward enough. The payments had begun as an informal arrangement, a gentleman's agreement between 2 men who had preferred quiet resolution to legal battle. Holloway had agreed to drop the boundary claim. James's father had agreed to the quarterly payments. Neither agreement had been documented in any way that would survive scrutiny, which meant that technically, legally, the boundary claim had never been formally relinquished, which meant that the eastern field, which the Ashford estate had been farming for 15 years on the quiet understanding that the matter was settled, was not settled, which meant that Margaret Holloway, who had not known about the payments and had not consented to the arrangement, and had not received a single penny of what her family was owed, had a claim. James sat with this for a long time. He thought about her father's eagerness when the invitation had arrived. The way he had sent his daughter rather than coming himself, not, James understood now, because he thought she could handle it better, but because he had needed her not to know. A daughter who knew about the payments was a daughter who might ask inconvenient questions. Better to send her in ignorance, let the Duke make whatever offer he was going to make, and handle the details afterward. She had been sent to that dinner not knowing what she was walking into, not knowing why she had been invited, not knowing what her presence was supposed to achieve. And she had sat at his table and been laughed at and walked out with her back straight, and gone home and found out anyway, and written him a letter in 8 words that had more clarity in it than anything said at that dinner by anyone. He wrote to his solicitor. He wrote 2 more letters after that. Then he packed a bag and told his man to have the horse ready at first light. He arrived on a Wednesday. Margaret was not in the garden this time. She was in the small sitting room off the front hall. He could see her through the window as he came up the path, seated at a writing desk with her back to him, the particular posture of someone concentrating, and for a moment he stopped and looked at her without her knowing he was there. She was writing quickly. Her head was slightly bent, one hand flat on the desk beside the paper the way some people anchor themselves when they are putting something important down. He could not see her face. He knocked. The housemaid showed him in. Margaret stood when he entered. She was not surprised. She had expected him. He could see that. Had been waiting in the particular way of a person who has decided how they are going to handle something and is ready to begin. She did not offer him a seat immediately. "You spoke to my father," she said. "I wrote to my estate manager first," he said. "I wanted to understand what was in the ledgers before I spoke to anyone." "And 15 years of quarterly payments," He said it plainly, no softening. She had not asked for softening and he was not going to offer it. Beginning the year after the dispute started, your father agreed to drop the boundary claim. My father agreed to pay for the quiet. Margaret nodded. She had known this, she had known it since Monday, since her father's study, but hearing it stated plainly by someone else seemed to settle it differently, made it fully real rather than partially real. He didn't tell you, James said. No. Did you know anything of it? Nothing, she said it without drama, just a fact placed precisely. I knew the dispute had stopped. I assumed it had been resolved. I didn't ask. A pause. I should have asked. You were not obliged to investigate your own father's accounts. No, she said, but I was obliged to know what I was walking into. She looked at him steadily. Neither of us knew what we were walking into at that dinner. I knew more than I've admitted, he said. She waited. I knew it had been quiet for years. I knew there was no formal resolution. I knew something had settled it and I didn't press to know what. He held her gaze. I preferred not to press. That is, in its way, its own kind of watching. The room was very still. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The look she gave things when she was thinking, not unfriendly, not warm, just fully present, fully engaged. The look of someone who was actually listening rather than preparing their response. What do you intend to do? She said. Return the field, he said. Formally, legally, with documentation this time. Whatever is owed in 15 years of use, I'll have my solicitor calculate it. He paused. I've written to him already. I've also written to your father. I wanted to speak to you first. Something moved across her face. Why? Because it's yours, he said. Not his. Yours. The arrangement was made without your knowledge and at your expense, and you are the one who found it and named it, and I thought you deserved to hear what I intend before anyone else does. Silence. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Sit down, Margaret said. He sat. She sat across from him, not at a table, no formal distance between them, just two chairs and the fire and the morning light coming through the window, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said, Tell me about the irregularities, all of them, from the beginning. He told her. It took longer than 20 minutes. When he finished, the fire had burned lower and the light through the window had shifted, and Margaret had not interrupted him once, which he had not expected, and had asked 4 questions at the end, each of which went directly to the point, which he had not expected either. He answered all 4. She was quiet for a moment after. Then my father will say he did it for the family, that the payments kept us solvent during the bad years. Did they? Yes, she said without hesitation. Probably. A pause. That doesn't make it right, it makes it complicated. She looked at the fire. I've been thinking about the difference between those two things since Monday. And I haven't finished thinking yet, she said, which was, James thought, one of the most honest things a person had said to him in recent memory. He stood to leave. At the door he stopped. Miss Holloway, she looked up. I want to say something that is not about the field. She waited. I have thought about that dinner every day since it happened, he said. Not the field, not the payments, not any of it. Just you, walking out, the carriage. He said it plainly, with the same directness she had given him in the garden because it was the least he owed her. I don't say that to complicate anything. I say it because it's true and because you have been honest with me and it seemed wrong not to return the same. Margaret looked at him. For the first time since he had met her, he could not read her expression entirely. Thank you, she said, for coming, and for the order in which you came. He nodded. He left. He was halfway down the path when he heard the front door open behind him. Your Grace, he turned. She was standing in the doorway. The morning light was behind her, the same flat gold and gray indecision as the night of the dinner, as every morning in November. You said you have been thinking about it every day, she said. Yes. What exactly, she said carefully, have you been thinking? He stood on the path in the cold and looked at her and said the true thing, because she had asked for the true thing, and because anything else would be another kind of watching. That I would like, he said, the opportunity to do it differently. Silence. A bird somewhere, a distant horse, the ordinary sounds of a morning that did not know it was anything other than ordinary. That, Margaret said at last, remains to be seen. She went back inside. James walked to his horse. He was smiling before he reached the gate. November became December. The field was returned on a Thursday. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and read through 12 pages of legal documentation with the same focused attention she gave everything that mattered. And when she finished, she set the papers down and looked out the window at the eastern field, her field, properly, finally, with documentation this time, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter than either. The specific feeling of a thing being made right that should never have been made wrong, which was its own category of satisfaction and carried, alongside the satisfaction, the shadow of everything the wrongness had cost. Her father had said very little since the Duke's letter had arrived. He had read it in his study alone, and when he emerged he had the look of a man who had been bracing for something for a long time and had found that the arrival of it was both worse and better than the bracing. Worse because it was real now. Better because the waiting was over. He had said, "I did what I thought was necessary." Margaret had said, "I know." She had said nothing else. She was still thinking about the difference between complicated and wrong, and she had not finished thinking, and she was not going to say more until she had. The letter arrived on a Monday, not from the Duke's solicitor this time, from the Duke. She recognized the handwriting before she turned it over, that decisive, slightly impatient hand, the letters of a man who wrote quickly and meant what he wrote. She took it upstairs to her room and sat by the window and broke the seal. It was 3 pages. She had expected business, another matter to be resolved, another irregularity uncovered, another formal communication dressed in the clothes of a personal one. It was not that. Miss Holloway. I am aware that 3 pages from me at this point may seem excessive. I considered a shorter letter and found I couldn't write it honestly. You have asked for honesty from the beginning, and it seems wrong to stop now simply because honesty has become inconvenient for me. The field is settled. My solicitor confirms the documentation is complete and will not be challenged. That matter is finished, and I will not refer to it again in this letter or in any subsequent correspondence unless you raise it yourself. What I want to say has nothing to do with the field. I have been in London for 3 weeks. I came back because there was business, which there was, and because I thought distance might make certain things clearer, which it has not. London is precisely as useful as it always is, which is to say moderately useful for business and entirely useless for thinking about anything that actually matters. I have been thinking about a conversation in a sitting room on a Wednesday morning, about a woman who listened to a long and not particularly flattering account of 15 years of her family's history, and asked 4 questions at the end, each of which went directly to the point, and none of which were the questions I had been bracing for. I had been bracing for anger. You were not angry. You were something I find harder to account for, which is simply clear. I told you at the door that I would like the opportunity to do it differently. You said that remained to be seen. That was the correct answer, and I am not writing to argue with it. I am writing because I think you deserve to know what differently means, in practical terms, so that you can make whatever assessment you are going to make with complete information. It means, I would like to write to you if you will permit it. Not about the field or the solicitors or any matter of business, about the things one writes to a person one is interested in. I am aware that interested in is doing considerable work in that sentence, and I am leaving it there intentionally, because anything more specific at this stage would be presumptuous, and anything less specific would be dishonest. It means, I would like, when I am next in the county, to call on you, properly, with your father's knowledge, which I recognize is a complicated thing given recent events, but which seems more honest than the alternative. It means, I will not watch again when I should speak. I cannot promise to always say the right thing. I can promise to say something. You are not obliged to answer this letter. If you choose not to, I will understand it as an answer. J. Ashford. Margaret read it twice. Then she put it down on the windowsill and looked at the eastern field for a long time. 3 pages. From a duke. Written in his own hand in London, which meant he had sat down at a desk in the middle of whatever his London life consisted of and written 3 pages to a woman in the country who had told him that his apology was insufficient and sent him to interrogate her father. I considered a shorter letter and found I couldn't write it honestly. She picked it up and read it again. The thing about the letter, the thing she was turning over with particular care, was its precision. It did not flatter. It did not charm. It did not do any of the things she would have expected a man in his position to do when writing to a woman in hers. It simply said what it meant in order without decoration. I am leaving it there intentionally, because anything more specific at this stage would be presumptuous. She set the letter down. She thought about a man on a garden path, smiling before he reached the gate. She had seen it, had been watching from the window, which she was not going to admit, and it had been brief and unguarded and entirely real. She went to her writing desk. She sat down. She did not write immediately. She sat for a while and thought about what she wanted to say and what she was willing to say and whether those were the same thing, and decided that they were, largely, which made the writing easier. Your Grace, 3 pages is not excessive. It is, however, notable, and I want you to know that I noticed. I will answer your questions in the order you ask them, which is the clearest way. You may write. I will read what you write and I will reply, which I think is the honest version of permission rather than the polite one. You may call when you are next in the county. My father will receive you. The complications of recent events are real, but they are not, I think, insurmountable, and in any case they are mine to manage and not yours to worry about. As for what differently means, I will tell you what it means from my end, so that you also have complete information. It means I will say what I think, which I have always done and intend to continue doing. If that becomes inconvenient, I would ask you to remember that you requested honesty and adjust accordingly. It means I have no interest in being managed around or handled carefully or treated as something fragile. I am not fragile. I am particular, which is different. It means that watching when you should speak is the one thing I will not forgive a second time. You said you cannot promise to always say the right thing. I am not asking for the right thing. I am asking for something, which, as you correctly identified, is a different standard and one I think you can meet. I notice you signed the letter with an initial rather than a title. I am choosing to take that as an indication of intended register rather than an oversight. M. Holloway. P.S. London is also useless for thinking about things that actually matter, in my limited experience of it. You might consider the country. She sealed it before she could reconsider the postscript. She sent it before she could reconsider sealing it. Then she sat at her desk in the quiet of the afternoon and thought about what she had just done, which was write a letter that was not careful or managed or shaped to land well, but was simply what she thought, said in the order she thought it. It felt, she decided, correct. Whether it was wise was a separate question and one she was going to set aside for now. His reply came on Thursday. 1 page this time. She noted the reduction without quite deciding what to make of it. M. I will be in the county on the 14th, if that is convenient. I take the postscript as the permission it was intended to be. London, you will be relieved to hear, has been abandoned. J. Margaret read it 3 times. She was smiling by the second time, which she considered a data point worth acknowledging. She went to find her father. He was in the study. He was always in the study. She knocked and came in and sat in the chair across from his desk, that chair, the one she had sat in her whole life, and looked at him. He looked back. He had the wary expression he had worn since the Duke's formal letter arrived, not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, but the particular wariness of a man who has been caught out by his own daughter and is not certain where they stand. "The Duke is coming on the 14th, Margaret said. Her father was quiet for a moment. "To call." "Yes," another pause. "On you." "Yes." He looked at his hands, then out the window, then at a point somewhere above her left shoulder that was easier than her face. "Margaret," he said, "what I did." "I know why you did it," she said. "I understand why. I haven't decided yet whether understanding is the same as forgiving, and I'm not going to say it is before I'm certain." She held his gaze when he finally looked at her. "But I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not going to make this decision," she meant the Duke, meant the 14th, meant whatever came after, based on what it does or doesn't resolve for you. "I'm going to make it based on what I think." Her father looked at her for a long time. He had the expression of a man seeing something he had always known was there, and had managed, until now, to look slightly past. "You sound like your mother," he said finally. "Good," Margaret said. She stood up. "I'll need the green sitting room on the 14th, the decent china." Her father blinked. "The decent china." "Yes." "You're sure?" "I'm particular," Margaret said. "Not uncertain. There's a difference." She left him to work that out. That night she sat by her window and looked out at the eastern field in the dark. It was just a field, flat, brown, unremarkable in the November night. It had no idea what it had cost or what it had started or how many letters had been written on its account. She thought about a dinner she had attended in her mother's dress because it was the best she had. She thought about a carriage on a dark road and a decision made in the cold. She thought about 12 pages of legal documentation and 3 pages of something else entirely, and 1 page after that, and a postscript she had sent before she could reconsider it. She thought, the 14th. Outside, the field lay in the dark exactly as it always had, belonging finally to exactly who it had always belonged to. Margaret went to bed. She slept very well. The 14th came and went. And then the 21st. And then the 1st of December. And then a Tuesday in the second week of December when it snowed lightly and Margaret made tea with the decent china for the 3rd time that month, and her father found reasons to be elsewhere in the house, with a consistency that suggested planning. James came on horseback. Always on horseback, always alone. No footman, no secretary, no performance of consequence. Margaret had noted this on the first visit and filed it carefully. A man who could arrive with ceremony and chose not to was telling her something about what he thought the visits were. They talked. That was the plain truth of it. They sat in the green sitting room with the decent china between them, and they talked. About the estate, about London, about a book he had sent ahead of the second visit with a note that said only, "You mentioned this in your 3rd letter," which meant he had been paying attention, which Margaret found more significant than flowers would have been. She told him about her mother's dress. Not immediately. Not the first visit or the second. On the 3rd, when the snow was coming down outside and the fire was high and the conversation had arrived, by some natural and unplanned route, at the subject of the dinner, not accusingly, not carefully, just arrived there the way conversations arrive at things when the people having them are being honest. She told him the dress had been her mother's, that it had been fashionable once, that she had known putting it on that it was not fashionable now and had decided it was the best she had and that the best she had should be enough. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't notice the dress." She looked at him. "I noticed you," he said, "at the door when you arrived. I noticed that you were not what I expected, and I didn't examine that further because I was—" A brief pause, the pause of a man being precise rather than flattering, occupied with other things. That was its own failure, separate from the one I've already accounted for. You're cataloging your failures, Margaret said. I'm being accurate. There's a difference between accuracy and penance, she said. I don't need the penance. He looked at her. What do you need? She considered this. I need you to notice now, she said. That's all, not instead of then, just now going forward consistently. I can do that, he said. I know, she said, that's why I said it. He did not come on the 28th. He had written ahead a state matter, unavoidable. He would come on the 30th if she was willing, and she had written back that the 30th was fine. And it had been fine, except that the 28th had been a Thursday, and she had found herself at 3:30 in the afternoon sitting in the green sitting room with a book she was not reading and an awareness of the empty chair across from her that she found, on reflection, informative. She did not mention this. She filed it. January arrived with the particular gray determination of a month that intends to be exactly as long as it is. James had gone back to London after Christmas. There were parliamentary matters, he had explained, things that couldn't be managed from the country, and she had said she understood, which she did, and he had said he would write, which he did, and the letters had continued with the same character as the visits. Direct, substantive, occasionally surprising. He wrote about Parliament with the frank exhaustion of a man who believed in its necessity and found its reality tedious. He wrote about a dinner he had attended where someone had made the same observation 3 times and been congratulated each time. He wrote, in his 5th letter, more carefully than the others, the handwriting slightly less impatient, that he missed the green sitting room, which was not, he acknowledged, the most elegant way of saying what he meant, but was the accurate one. Margaret wrote back about the field, which was being properly fenced at last, and about a neighbor's daughter who had asked her advice about a situation Margaret was not going to describe in detail, but which had required the better part of an afternoon and the entire pot of tea. She wrote about a book she had disagreed with strongly, and found she had enjoyed more for the disagreeing. She wrote in her 6th letter that the green sitting room was, she had come to understand, improved by a second chair being occupied, which was not, she acknowledged, the most elegant way of saying what she meant either. His reply came in 2 days, which was faster than usual. February brought a letter of a different kind. She almost missed the change in it. The handwriting was the same, the seal was the same, and the first page was business enough that she had turned to the second before she understood what she was reading. He was coming back. That was the first thing. He would be in the county by the end of the month. The second thing was the question. It was placed in the middle of the second page, between a paragraph about the parliamentary session and a paragraph about the fencing, which she suspected was intentional. No ceremony around it, no build-up, just the thing itself placed plainly in the middle of other plain things. I want to ask you something when I come. I am telling you in advance because I think you prefer to have information before events rather than during them, and because if the answer is no, I would rather you have time to think about it than feel ambushed into a response. If the answer is no, I will accept it and we will have tea and talk about the book you disagreed with, and I will not raise it again unless you do. If the answer is yes, I would like to have the conversation properly in person, which is why I am not asking it here. I think you know what I am going to ask. Margaret read it, put it down, picked it up. She did know what he was going to ask. She had known, she thought, since the postscript she had sent before she could reconsider it. Possibly since the garden that first morning, the moment she had turned and found him still there. She sat at her window and looked at the eastern field, fenced now, properly, hers, and thought about a woman in a carriage on a dark road making a decision that had turned out to be, in ways she had not anticipated, the beginning of something rather than the end. She thought about what she was going to say. She thought about it for a long time. She did not, in the end, write back before he came. Some answers, she had decided, were better given in person. He arrived on the 24th. It had snowed again overnight, and the path to the house was freshly white, and the elm trees along the drive stood bare and dark against it, and everything had the particular clarity of a winter morning that has decided to be beautiful whether or not anyone is paying attention. Margaret was at the window when she saw him come through the gate. She did not go down immediately. She took her time, finished what she was doing, which was nothing, which she acknowledged was not particularly convincing, and then went downstairs with the measured pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and was simply on her way there. Her father was in the hallway. He had answered the door himself, which he never did, which meant he had been waiting. He looked at her when she came down the stairs. She looked at him. "The decent china," she said. He nodded. Something in his expression, not quite a smile, but its near neighbor, moved briefly and was gone. He went to find the decent china. James was in the green sitting room. He was standing at the window when she came in, looking out at the garden, the bare rose beds, the iron gate in the wall, the gray-white sky above the field. He turned when he heard her. He looked well. Better than London, she thought. The parliamentary exhaustion had lifted. He had the look of a man who had come from somewhere he needed to leave to somewhere he needed to be, and who had noticed the difference. "You didn't write back," he said. "No," she said. I wasn't sure whether that was an answer. It wasn't, she said. It was a preference for in person. Something moved in his eyes, relief, she thought, or the beginning of it. She sat down. He sat across from her. The decent china was between them and the fire was high, and outside the window the snow was doing what snow does in February, which is remain exactly where it has fallen with the patient indifference of something that has nowhere else to be. "Ask me then," Margaret said. He looked at her across the fire and the china and the months of letters and the field outside and the dinner that had started all of it, and he asked. He asked properly, as he had said he would. Margaret listened to the whole of it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. She thought about a dress that had been her mother's, about a carriage on a dark road, about a note with 5 words in a garden in the morning, and a man who had come back anyway and sat in this chair in this room month after month, and said what he meant and meant what he said and noticed, consistently, which she had asked for and which he had provided. She thought about the empty chair on the 28th. She thought about a postscript sent before she could reconsider it. Yes, she said, simple, unadorned. The way she said things when she had decided to say them properly. James was quiet for a moment. "Then, I should tell you, my solicitor will want to discuss the property arrangements, and there are several matters relating to the estate that—" "James," she said, he stopped. "We can discuss the solicitor tomorrow," she said. "Today I would like you to simply have said yes and received it." He looked at her. Then he did something she had seen only once before, that brief, unguarded, entirely real laugh. The one that changed his face completely. The one that was over before you could quite catch it, but that left something warmer in its wake. "Yes," he said, "all right." Outside the snow remained exactly where it had fallen. The fire burned steadily. The decent china sat between them, patient and unhurried, not going anywhere. That evening, after James had gone and the house had settled into its ordinary night sounds, Margaret went to her father's study. He looked up. She sat in the chair across from his desk. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. Her father looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who had made mistakes and knew it, and was watching his daughter choose, from a position of complete information, to build something good anyway. Not because the mistakes were forgiven, or not only because of that, but because she had decided that what was ahead was more worth her attention than what was behind. "Your mother," he said, "would have managed him completely within a fortnight." "I know," Margaret said. "I intend to take at least 3 weeks." Her father made a sound that was, undeniably, a laugh. Margaret stood up. At the door she stopped. "Father," he looked up. "I haven't finished thinking," she said. "About the rest of it, I want you to know that I haven't finished." "I know," he said quietly, "but I'm not going anywhere." He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man receiving something he knows he has not entirely earned and is grateful for anyway. Margaret went upstairs. She sat at her writing desk. She did not write a letter. There was no letter to write tonight. James was barely down the road. She would see him tomorrow about the solicitor and the property arrangements and all the practical machinery of yes. She just sat for a while in the quiet of her room and thought about the shape of things. A dress, a carriage, a decision on a dark road, a field properly fenced, belonging finally to exactly who it should. And ahead of that, she looked out the window at the snow, still exactly where it had fallen, patient and unhurried. Ahead of that, something she did not have the full shape of yet. That was all right. She was particular. She would work it out as she went. March arrived like an argument. Cold one day, deceptively mild the next, then cold again. The kind of month that could not decide what it wanted to be and made everyone around it pay for the indecision. The roads between Holloway and Ashford Hall became variously passable and impassable depending on the day and the rain, which meant James came when he could and wrote when he couldn't, and Margaret had developed, without particularly intending to, a reliable sense of which mornings would produce a letter and which would produce hoofbeats on the path. She preferred the hoofbeats. She had not told him this. She thought he probably knew. The engagement had been announced quietly. Her father had placed the notice. James had informed the relevant people in London, and the county had received the information with the particular combination of surprise and retroactive certainty that communities deploy when something unexpected turns out to have been obvious all along. Of course, people said, having said nothing of the sort before. One could see it coming. Margaret found this neither irritating nor gratifying. It was simply what people did. What she had not anticipated was the other thing. The thing that arrived not in letters or notices but in drawing rooms, in the careful conversations of women who had known the Ashford name longer than they had known Margaret Holloway, and who had opinions about the distance between those two things. It began with Mrs. Alderton. Mrs. Alderton was 60, wealthy, and had attended every social event in the county for 40 years with the consistency of a natural phenomenon. She called on Margaret on a Wednesday morning in the second week of March, accompanied by her daughter, and sat in the green sitting room with the expression of a woman performing a kindness. "My dear Miss Holloway," she said, accepting tea with the air of someone granting a favor. "How very surprising, all of this." "Is it?" Margaret said. "Well," a small smile, the kind that carried information without committing to it. "The Duke of Ashford he moves in rather particular circles, London circles. One wonders how, a delicate pause, how you will find it." "I expect I will find it as I find most things," Margaret said pleasantly, "by going there and paying attention." Mrs. Alderton's smile held. "Of course. Though London can be, the people there can be rather." She glanced at her daughter, who was examining her teacup with sudden concentration. "Exacting." "I have some experience with exacting people," Margaret said. "I manage." She said it with the same even tone she used for everything, which gave Mrs. Alderton nothing to object to specifically, and yet communicated, with some precision, that the line of inquiry was not one Margaret intended to follow further. Mrs. Alderton changed the subject. After they left, Margaret sat for a moment in the empty sitting room. She was not wounded. Mrs. Alderton was not the first and would not be the last, and the observation, "one wonders how you will find it," was not even particularly sharp. It was the blunt instrument of a woman who had never needed to be subtle because the social order had always worked in her favor, but it sat there in the room for a while after she left. London circles, rather exacting. Margaret poured herself a second cup of tea and thought, with the clear, unflinching honesty she applied to things she would rather not examine, about what she actually knew of James's world. She knew the letters. She knew the green sitting room. She knew a man on horseback on a winter morning, no ceremony, no performance. She did not know the London rooms, the dinner tables, the women who had known him for years and would look at her the way the women at that first dinner had looked at her dress, that swift, merciless, categorizing look. She thought about her mother's dress. Then she thought about what she had decided in the carriage. She finished her tea. She was not going to manage this by worrying about it from a sitting room in the country. She was going to manage it by going and paying attention, which was what she had told Mrs. Alderton and which was, as it happened, true. She told James about it that Thursday. Not the whole of it, not the sitting with it afterward, the honest examination, just the visit itself, Mrs. Alderton's particular smile, the comment about London circles. She told it straightforwardly, not seeking reassurance, just reporting. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong that London can be exacting," he said. Margaret looked at him. "I'm not going to tell you it won't happen," he said. "People will look at you the way they look at anything they haven't categorized yet. Some of them will say things. Some of them will say things in front of me." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that I will not watch." She studied his face. "I know you won't," she said. "That isn't what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that London is a thing I have no practice with and you have considerable practice with, and that I will need to learn it as I go, and that learning things as you go involves making mistakes, and that I would like to make those mistakes without," she paused, finding the word, "without being managed around them." "I won't manage you." "You might want to," she said, "with good intentions. You'll see me get something wrong and you'll want to smooth it over and protect me from the consequence." She looked at him steadily. "Don't. Let me get it wrong and fix it myself. I'll learn faster." He looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said, "is going to require considerable restraint on my part." "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." "Yes," he said. "All right." April brought the first real warmth, and with it a letter from James's mother. Margaret had been expecting this. James had mentioned her carefully, in the way of a man navigating a subject that had history to it. A widow, Ashford Hall her primary residence for 30 years, with opinions about the estate, its management, and apparently its future duchess. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph welcomed Margaret to the family, with the formal warmth of a woman who had composed many such letters, and knew exactly how much warmth was appropriate. The second paragraph expressed a hope that Margaret would visit Ashford Hall at her earliest convenience, as there were matters relating to the household that would benefit from her attention. The third paragraph was 4 sentences and contained the information that a Miss Grantham, an old friend of James's, a particular friend, you understand, Miss Holloway, a woman of considerable accomplishment, would also be visiting that week, and that she hoped Margaret would enjoy making her acquaintance. Margaret read it twice. She set it down. She picked it up. A particular friend. She went to find James. He was at the fence line of the eastern field, talking to her father's new farm manager about the spring drainage, and he turned when he heard her coming across the grass with the expression of a man who could read, at considerable distance, when something had arrived that required attention. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His jaw tightened. "Miss Grantham," Margaret said. "Emma Grantham." He folded the letter, handed it back. There was a period several years ago, it ended clearly and entirely, and she married someone else the following year." A pause. "She is now a widow." "Your mother knows this." "My mother," he said, with the careful restraint of a man who had been having a version of this conversation for 30 years, "has opinions about most things and acts on them without always consulting the people most affected." "She's testing me," Margaret said. He looked at her. "Before I arrive properly," Margaret said. "She wants to see what I do with the information." She considered this. "It's actually rather intelligent." It's rather, he stopped himself. You're not angry. I'm thinking, she said. There's a difference. She looked at the field, at the new fence posts bright against the April grass. When are we expected? The second week of May. Then I have a month, she said. For what? To decide how to handle Miss Grantham, she said. And your mother, she glanced at him. Not with strategy, just to think about what kind of person I want to be in those rooms. James looked at her with the full, unhurried attention she had come to know, as his version of being completely present. I'll be there, he said, whatever happens. I know, she said. I'm not worried about what happens. I'm thinking about who I want to be while it happens. A pause. Those are different things. He nodded slowly. Then, you're going to be fine. I know, she said, with the calm certainty of someone who has considered the matter and arrived at a conclusion. I just want to be fine in the right way. May arrived. Ashford Hall in spring was, as James had warned her, rather grand. The drive was lined with chestnut trees in full bloom, the house itself enormous against the morning sky, the kind of house that had been important for so long it had stopped needing to announce it. Margaret sat in the carriage and looked at it coming toward her and felt, for the first time in several months, a version of the feeling she had felt on the drive to that first dinner. Not the same. She was not the same person who had sat in that carriage, but in the same family of feelings, the slight gathering of oneself, the quiet decision about how to walk through a door. She gathered herself. She made the decision. The carriage stopped. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford was 62, upright, and had the eyes of a woman who had been assessing people for 4 decades and saw no reason to stop now. She looked at Margaret in the entrance hall with the direct, unhurried attention of someone conducting an examination they have no intention of disguising. Margaret looked back. Miss Holloway, the Dowager said. Your Grace, a curtsy proper, neither excessive nor minimal. Thank you for the invitation. The Dowager's eyes moved over her with that swift categorizing efficiency, not unkind exactly but thorough, and then she said unexpectedly, You're taller than I expected. I'm told I stand straight, Margaret said. It has that effect. Something shifted in the Dowager's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a slight recalibration. The look of a woman who had asked a question and received an answer she had not predicted. Come in, she said. Miss Grantham is in the drawing room. Emma Grantham was everything Margaret had imagined and therefore not quite a surprise. She was beautiful, genuinely, in the way of women who have always been beautiful and have had long enough to become comfortable with it. She had the London ease that Margaret had been warned about, the particular fluency of a woman who had moved through these rooms for years and knew their rhythms as her own. She looked at Margaret when she entered with an expression that was perfectly gracious and entirely unreadable. Miss Holloway, she said, I've heard so much. Have you? Margaret said pleasantly. I'm afraid I've heard rather less. James mentioned you briefly. A beat. Very brief, almost imperceptible. Of course, Emma said, still gracious, still unreadable. He always was concise. He is, Margaret agreed. I find I prefer it. She sat down, tea was brought. The Dowager watched from her chair with the expression of a woman attending a performance she had arranged and was now assessing for quality. The visit lasted 3 days. On the first day, Emma was gracious and Margaret was pleasant, and the Dowager watched everything and said very little. On the second day, James and Margaret walked the grounds in the morning, while the Dowager and Emma had their own arrangements, and he asked how she was finding it. Your mother is sharper than she appears, Margaret said. She appears extremely sharp, James said. Exactly, Margaret said. She appears it, which means the real sharpness is something additional. He looked at her sideways. And Emma. She is managing something, Margaret said. I don't know what yet. Not malice, it's not that simple, she considered. She had something she chose to let go of, and she is deciding whether she chose correctly. That's harder than malice. James was quiet for a moment. "You're not threatened," he said. "No," she said. "I'm paying attention." She glanced at him. "You said you'd be there." "I'm here." "You haven't done anything." "You haven't needed anything," he said. "You said let you handle it yourself." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked at him. This man who had ridden to her garden in the morning and stayed on the path in the rain and written 3 pages when one would have been easier, and had stood every time she had asked him to, exactly where she asked and no further. "Yes," she said, "that's right." She took his arm. They walked on. On the 3rd day in the afternoon, the dowager found Margaret alone in the library. She came in without ceremony and sat in the chair across from her, with the directness of a woman who had decided something and saw no reason to approach it indirectly. "I want to say something," the dowager said. "All right," Margaret said. "I had a plan for this visit," the dowager said. "I had several plans, actually, over several years for James. None of them came to anything because James is," a brief pause, "particular about what he will and will not be managed into." "I know something about particular," Margaret said. The dowager looked at her steadily. "Yes, I can see that." She folded her hands in her lap. "I put Emma in this visit because I wanted to see what you would do." "I know," Margaret said. "You're not angry." "You were protecting your son," Margaret said. "In the way available to you, I understand it." A pause. "I don't require it to have been comfortable." The dowager was quiet for a moment. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was not warm exactly, but in the same family as warm. The look of a woman arriving somewhere she had not expected to arrive. "He was not happy," she said. "For a long time, after Cecilia, after the business with Emma, there was a period of years when I could not reach him." She said it plainly, without drama. "He went through the motions very adequately. He managed everything. He was correct." A pause. "He came back from the country in November and he was not correct anymore. He was present. In a way he hadn't been." Margaret said nothing. "I wanted to dislike you," the dowager said. "It would have been simpler." "I know," Margaret said. "I find I can't." Margaret looked at the dowager. This woman who had watched her son disappear into correctness and come back changed, and had responded the only way she knew, which was to test the thing that had changed him. "I'm not going to manage him," Margaret said. "I want you to know that. I'm not going to make his decisions or smooth his path or tell him what to think." A pause. "But I will be there, consistently. That is the only thing I know how to promise, and it is the one I intend to keep." The dowager looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "The decent china is in the east cupboard, for when you host, I'll have Mrs. Holt show you." Margaret understood this was not about china. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," the dowager said, standing. "Just don't give me reason to revise my opinion." She left. Margaret sat in the library for a while. Outside the window, the chestnut trees stood in the May afternoon light, in full bloom, unhurried. She thought about a woman who had stood on a step in the cold and been handed a note with 5 words on it and put it in her pocket without answering. She thought about everything that had been the consequence of that. She picked up her book. She was smiling. On the last morning, Emma found her in the garden. Margaret had half expected it. Emma was too precise a person to leave something unfinished, and there was, Margaret had felt for 3 days, something unfinished between them. She came to stand beside Margaret at the rose bed, the Ashford roses, old and carefully tended, and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then, "He never looked at me the way he looks at you." Margaret said nothing. "I don't say that to wound you," Emma said. "I say it because I spent 2 years wondering whether I had made a mistake, and I have spent 3 days understanding that I hadn't." A pause. "He was fond of me. We were comfortable together. I thought that was enough." She looked at the roses. "It wasn't." No, Margaret said quietly, it isn't. Emma glanced at her, something in her expression not grief exactly or not only grief, the older, quieter thing. Take care of him, she said. I intend to, Margaret said, in the way of not managing him and being consistently present, which is apparently what's required. Emma looked at her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, brief, genuine. The laugh of a woman who had been holding something carefully and had just been given permission to set it down. Yes, she said, that would do it. She went back inside. Margaret stood at the rose bed for a while longer. The morning was warm, properly warm for the first time this year. The kind of warmth that means spring has stopped negotiating and made up its mind. She thought about the Dowager and Emma and the 3 days and what she had learned, which was this. She had walked into rooms that were not hers and found, steadily and without managing, that she could be herself in them. Not Cecilia's pink, not her mother's dress, herself. That was, she decided, the thing she had been building since the carriage, since the decision on the dark road, brick by quiet brick. James found her in the garden an hour later. He came from the house with the unhurried pace of a man who is not performing anything, just walking towards something he wants to reach. He stopped beside her. My mother, he said. We had a conversation, Margaret said. It was fine. Fine, he repeated, with the tone of a man who understood that fine from Margaret covered considerable ground. She showed me where the decent china is, Margaret said. He looked at her. She approved, Margaret said, in her way. Her way being telling me not to give her reason to revise her opinion. James was quiet for a moment. Then, that is, for her, practically a declaration of affection. I know, Margaret said. I took it as one. He looked at her sideways, the particular look she had come to recognize as his version of being quietly, thoroughly glad about something. You managed it, he said. I didn't manage anything, she said. I was simply myself in several rooms and let the rooms decide what to do with that. That, he said, sounds deceptively simple. Most true things do, she said. He offered his arm, she took it. They walked back toward the house, toward the chestnut trees and the grand front steps and the rooms that were going to be hers, in the way of belonging rather than acquisition, in the way of a woman who had decided in a carriage on a dark road that she was not going back. She had not gone back. She had gone forward instead, which was, she thought, the better direction. They came back from Ashford Hall on a Friday. Margaret's house felt smaller after 3 days in the other one, not uncomfortably so, just differently scaled, the way a familiar room looks briefly strange after an absence. She walked through it when she got back, not because she needed anything, but because she wanted the reassurance of its smallness, its ordinariness, the hook by the door where her gardening gloves hung and the clock in the hallway that ran 4 minutes fast and always had. She was home. For a few more weeks home. After that, Ashford Hall, the East Wing, the decent china in the cupboard Mrs. Holt had shown her, a life that was not yet fully imaginable, which did not frighten her because the parts of it she could imagine were, on balance, good. She hung up her coat. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and was very quiet for a while, which was what she did after things that had required sustained attention. Let the attention wind down, let the room be ordinary, let herself be ordinary in it. Her father came in at 6:30. He sat across from her. They drank tea in the comfortable silence of two people who had been in conflict, and had not entirely resolved it, and had decided, mutually and without discussion, that the unresolved parts did not prevent the comfortable silences. How was it? He said. Good, she said. He waited. His mother is formidable, Margaret said. She tested me. And I passed. A pause, I think. Her version of passing is telling me not to give her reason to change her mind, so the test, technically, continues indefinitely. Her father made a sound. Sounds exhausting. It sounds honest, Margaret said. I prefer it to the alternative. He nodded. They drank their tea. Outside the window, the May evening was doing the soft, unhurried thing that May evenings did, light lasting longer than expected. The garden going gold at the edges, the eastern field flat and quiet in the distance. "Father," Margaret said. He looked up. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the rest of it." He went still. "I haven't finished," she said. "I told you that I'm still not finished." She held his gaze. "But I want you to know that I understand what you were doing. Not just that you did it, I understand why. The bad years, the field, what it cost." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you it was right, but I'm going to tell you I understand it, and that understanding is, I think, the beginning of the rest." Her father looked at her for a long time. He was not a man who showed things easily. He had the face of someone who had learned, over many years, to keep things on the inside where they could not be used against him. But something moved across it now. Something that did not have a precise name but was in the family of relief and gratitude and the particular sorrow of a man who has been given more than he expected after deserving less. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," Margaret said. "Just be better going forward." "Yes," he said. She nodded. She poured him more tea. The wedding was set for the first week of June. Not a large wedding, neither of them wanted large, which had been the first and easiest thing they had agreed on. The church in the village, the people who mattered, a dinner afterward at Ashford Hall with the decent china deployed in full. The weeks before it had the quality of a river approaching a bend, everything moving toward a single point, gathering speed imperceptibly, and then the bend itself arriving faster than expected. There were things to be done. There were always things to be done. Margaret did them with the focused efficiency she brought to everything practical. The correspondence, the arrangements, the particular negotiations between her father's household and James's that required patience and specificity in equal measure. And in the middle of all of it, ordinary life continued, because it always did. She gardened. She wrote letters. She read the book she had disagreed with and then read it again, which she had told James about, and he had said that was either very open-minded or very stubborn, and she had said she hadn't decided yet. He came when he could, which was often enough. On a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of May, he arrived to find her up a ladder trimming the climbing rose on the south wall of the garden, which was something that could have been left to the garden boy, and which Margaret had decided, for reasons she did not examine too carefully, to do herself. He stood on the path below and looked up at her. "Is there a reason," he said, "that the garden boy isn't doing that?" "I'm doing it," she said. "I can see that." "Then your question answers itself." He leaned against the garden wall with his arms folded and watched her for a moment. "You're going to do this at Ashford Hall," he said. "Climb things that don't need climbing." "Your roses need work," she said without looking down. "I noticed in May, the east beds haven't been properly cut back." "I have 3 gardeners who have not properly cut back the east beds," she said. A pause. "I'll tell them you're coming," he said. "Tell them I'm coming and I'll want to do some of it myself," she corrected. "There's a difference." He looked up at her on the ladder in the afternoon light, her gardening gloves, her complete composure at an unnecessary height, the focused attention she brought to everything whether it required it or not, and she heard below her the sound she had come to wait for without admitting she waited for it. Brief, low, entirely real. She came down the ladder. 3 days before the wedding it rained. Not the mild spring rain that had been coming and going for weeks, but something heavier and more committed, the kind that settles in before noon and makes clear it intends to stay for the duration. James arrived at 10:30, considerably wetter than he had intended, and Margaret's housemaid took his coat with the expression of a woman unsurprised by this development. He found Margaret in the green sitting room. She looked up when he came in, looked at him, the damp coat on the hook, the rain still visible through the window behind him. You rode in this, she said. It wasn't raining when I left. It has been raining since 8 o'clock. I may have left later than I intended. She looked at him, he looked back. There was something in the room, not quite tension, not quite its opposite. Something that had been building for weeks, since May, since the garden and the ladder and the 3 days at Ashford Hall, accumulating with the quiet patience of things that have decided to become real regardless of whether you are ready for them. 3 days, she thought. 3 days and then the church and then Ashford Hall and the East Wing and the decent china and the life she could not yet fully imagine. She had not been frightened of it before. She found, sitting in the green sitting room with the rain on the windows and James standing in the doorway still slightly damp, that she was not frightened of it now either. But she was something that was in the same family as frightened without being it. Sit down, she said. He sat. She looked at him across the fire, this man who had come through the rain on a Tuesday morning, because he had intended to come, and the rain had not changed that, and said, because she had learned to say the true thing. I want to tell you something. All right, he said. I have been, she found the word, calm about all of this. The engagement, the arrangements, the visit to your mother. I have been calm because that is how I approach things and because being calm is generally the correct approach. She held his gaze. But I want you to know that the calm is not the whole of it. He waited. I am not, she paused. I am not someone who says things easily, the large things. I say the honest things and the direct things and the practical things, but the large things, she stopped, started again. I want to say something large and I want to say it before the church because after the church there will be people and arrangements and the machinery of it, and I would like to say it now here, where there is only the fire and the rain. James was very still. I love you, Margaret said. She said it the way she said things when she had decided to say them properly, plainly, without decoration. Not because you returned the field or wrote 3 pages or came through the rain, she said. Those things are evidence, but the thing itself, she looked at him steadily, is the thing itself, and I wanted to say it before the church. The room was very quiet, the rain on the windows, the fire. James looked at her across the ordinary, extraordinary space of the green sitting room, the decent china between them, the chair he had occupied for months, the room that had become, without ceremony, the room where things were said properly. Margaret, he said. Yes. I have been in love with you, he said, since the garden, the first morning, when you told me a note and a morning visit didn't change what the watching was. A pause. I didn't know what to call it then. I called it a great deal of other things first, but that was when. She looked at him. I know, he said, that you prefer information given in advance of events, so. He held her gaze. There it is. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, you have known since September and said nothing. I was working up to it. For 8 months. I wanted to say it properly, he said, when it was the right time. The right time, she said, was apparently 3 days before the wedding in the rain. In the green sitting room, he said, which seemed right. She looked at him, he looked back. Outside the rain came down, with the steady, committed persistence of something that had decided on a direction, and was not reconsidering. Come here, she said. He came. Not the formal distance of the green sitting room visits, not the measured propriety of the drawing room at Ashford Hall. He came and sat beside her, and she looked at him close up, this face she had been reading for 8 months, that gave nothing away unless it chose to. That chose to now, and she thought about a woman in a carriage making a decision on a dark road. She had decided never to go back. She had not known then where forward led. She knew now. She reached out and straightened his collar, which was still slightly damp and had turned up on one side, and he caught her hand when she finished and did not let go. They sat by the fire while the rain decided the weather for them, which was, Margaret thought, the rain's business entirely. She did not mind. The morning of the wedding was clear. The rain had spent itself overnight and left the world clean and bright and smelling of wet grass and new leaves, the kind of morning that does not require commentary because it has already said everything. Margaret dressed in her own room for the last time. Not her mother's dress. She had known that since September 2, since the carriage, since the decision. Her own dress, made for this, ivory and simple and exactly hers. Clara fastened the last button and stepped back and looked at her in the glass with the expression of a woman of 6 years' service who had opinions and was choosing, on this particular morning, not to voice them. "Well," Margaret said. "You look like yourself," Clara said. "Miss." "Good," Margaret said. "That's the intention." The church was the village church, small and stone and older than most things in the county, and when Margaret came through the doors on her father's arm, the light inside was the particular gold of June mornings through old glass, warm, slightly amber, the kind of light that makes everything look as though it has been there a long time. James was at the front. He turned when she came in. She walked toward him, and he watched her come the whole length of that aisle, not performing, not managing, not doing anything except looking at her with the full, unhurried attention she had learned to receive without looking away. And when she reached him, he said, quietly, just to her, "You look like yourself." Clara said the same thing, she said. Clara is observant. Don't tell her she'll become insufferable. He smiled, not the brief, unguarded one, not the laugh, something steadier than both, and offered his hand. She took it. Epilogue I'll by Tyrium me. London in October was nothing like the county. Margaret had known this in the abstract, had known it the way you know things you have been told rather than things you have experienced. But abstract knowledge and actual knowledge were, she had found, reliably different things, and London in October was one of the more vivid examples. It was louder. It was faster. It moved with the particular urgency of a city that had decided long ago that stopping was not something it intended to do and had been proving the point ever since. The streets, the drawing rooms, the dinner tables, everything had a current to it, a direction, and if you did not know the direction, you were likely to find yourself moving against it without quite understanding why. Margaret had spent 4 months learning the direction. She had made mistakes. She had said the wrong thing on 2 occasions that she knew of and possibly more that she didn't. She had attended a dinner in September where she had committed the apparently significant error of expressing a genuine opinion about a political matter which was not done, or not done by women in that particular room, and the silence that followed had been the educational kind. James had not smoothed it over. He had later in the carriage said, "You were right, incidentally." "I know," she had said, "that wasn't the mistake." "No," he had agreed, "the mistake was the room." "I'll learn the rooms," she had said. "You already are," he had said. She was. October brought the season's last significant dinner. It was at the Harrington house. Enormous, Mayfair. The kind of event that required a week's advance notice and the correct dress and the particular attention of a woman who had spent 4 months learning which rooms required what. Margaret wore blue. Not her mother's, not borrowed. Her own, made this season, and she had stood in front of the glass before leaving and thought, yes, that's right. James had said nothing when he saw her, which was his version of saying a great deal. They arrived to find the rooms already full. The Harrington dinners ran to 40 people, which Margaret had learned meant 20 conversations happening simultaneously, and the particular social mathematics of a room where everyone was tracking everyone else while appearing to track no one. She had become, in 4 months, reasonably competent at these mathematics. She took a glass, she greeted the people she knew, she met the people she didn't, and she moved through the room with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and was simply on her way there. She was halfway across the second drawing room when she heard it. Not directed at her, not this time. A comment from a cluster of women near the window, one of whom she recognized from the season's earlier dinners. Mrs. Alderton's daughter, Charlotte, now fully her mother's in manner and method. The comment was about someone else, a young woman across the room, recently arrived in London, provincial in the way that Margaret had been provincial 4 months ago. The comment was about her dress. The laughter that followed was the loose, careless kind. Margaret stopped. She stood very still for a moment. She thought about a dining room in November, about the particular sound of that laughter, about a carriage and a dark road and a decision made in the cold. She thought about James somewhere behind her and what she had said to him in the green sitting room. "I will say what I think. I'm not asking for the right thing. I'm asking for something." She crossed the room. She stopped beside the young woman, whose name she did not know, whose dress was indeed 2 seasons old, whose face had the carefully composed expression of someone who had heard and was not going to show it, and she said, "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Margaret Ashford." The young woman looked at her, startled, then grateful, then attempting to conceal the gratitude because gratitude felt like admitting the wound. Margaret understood this completely. "Anne Voss," the young woman said. "Miss Voss." Margaret smiled, not the performed smile of social rooms, but the real one, the one Clara occasionally said made her look like herself. "Are you newly in London? I only ask because I was 4 months ago and I found it rather—" She glanced briefly, deliberately toward the window cluster, clarifying. Anne Voss looked at her, then quietly, clarifying. "It tells you a great deal," Margaret said, "about which rooms are worth your time. A beat." "Yes," Anne Voss said, "I'm beginning to see that." She found James 20 minutes later near the fireplace with 2 other men, deep in the kind of conversation that had the particular quality of matters being decided rather than discussed. He saw her coming and excused himself, smoothly, without ceremony, and came to meet her. "You crossed the room," he said. "Yes. I saw." "I know you saw," she said. "That was rather the point." He looked at her. "I wasn't going to watch," she said. "That was the one thing I asked of you, and it seemed wrong not to ask it of myself as well." James was quiet for a moment. Then, who was she? Anne Voss, newly arrived, provincial. Margaret glanced across the room to where Anne Voss was now in conversation with a different group, her composure restored, something slightly steadier in her bearing than before. "She'll be fine. She just needed someone to stand beside her for a moment." "Is that what you needed?" James said. "In November." Margaret thought about it honestly. "I needed the carriage," she said. "I needed the dark road and the decision. I needed it to happen the way it happened, because that was what made me understand what I was made of." She paused. "But a person standing beside me for a moment would not have gone amiss." James looked at her with the full, unhurried attention that was. She had come to understand. His most fundamental way of saying something he did not always put into words. "You're going to do this all season," he said. "Cross rooms." "Probably," she said. "London will find you alarming." "London," she said, "will find me consistent, which is more alarming, I grant you." He offered his arm, she took it. They went in to dinner. Later in the carriage home, the city moving past the windows in its nighttime version quieter, amber-lit, the streets emptying toward midnight, Margaret sat beside James and looked out at London and thought about the shape of things. 4 months. She had learned the rooms, or was learning them, which was the honest version. She had made mistakes and fixed them herself and made different mistakes and fixed those too. She had stood in drawing rooms that were not hers and found that she could be herself in them without the rooms winning. She had crossed a room tonight. Not for herself, for someone else, which was, she thought, a different order of thing. The first kind was survival, the second kind was choice. She had chosen. James's hand found hers in the dark of the carriage. which was not something he did in public, and was therefore something he did in private with the quiet consistency she had come to rely on the way she relied on the clock in the hallway that ran 4 minutes fast, not because it was convenient, but because it was there always in the same place, doing the same thing. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. They sat in the dark and watched London go past, and the carriage moved through the amber streets with the steady, unhurried pace of something that knew where it was going and was not in a particular rush about it. They were home by midnight. Ashford Hall in London, the townhouse, vast and formal in the way of all the Ashford buildings which had been built by people who believed that scale was a statement worth making, was lit against the dark, the entrance warm and waiting. Margaret stood on the steps for a moment before going in. She looked up at the house. Enormous, she thought, and so serious. Every room looks like it's waiting for something important to happen. She had thought that the first time she saw it in May. She thought it still. But she had found in 4 months of living in those serious rooms that the waiting had been for something ordinary, for people. For the clock that ran 4 minutes fast and the gardening gloves on the hook and the decent china and the green sitting room and all the unremarkable, irreplaceable furniture of a life being lived rather than arranged. James stopped beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That the rooms were waiting," she said. "For what?" "For us to be ordinary in them," she said. "That's all, just ordinary." He looked at her, then at the house, then back at her. "I think," he said, "we can manage that." She smiled. They went inside. In the morning she was in the garden before 8. Not the Ashford Hall garden, the London garden, smaller, walled, with the rose beds she had identified in May, and which the 3 gardeners had been informed. She intended to attend to herself on a rotating and non-negotiable basis. She was on her knees beside the east bed, gardening gloves on, when she heard the door from the house open. James. She knew his step. He came and stood beside her and looked at what she was doing, which was cutting back a section that had been left too long, and had the slightly reproachful look of something that had been waiting patiently and was running out of patience. "You're doing it again," he said. "Someone has to," she said. "There are 3. "I know there are 3, she said. "This is the part I'm doing." He crouched beside her. She looked at him this close this early, his hair still slightly disordered from sleep, the serious face that was not, she had found, serious at all underneath, just careful. And she thought about a note with 5 words and a garden in November, and a man who had come back anyway. "You could go back inside," she said. "It's cold." "It's October," he said. Exactly. He did not go back inside. He stayed crouched beside her in the cold October morning, not helping exactly, not getting in the way, just present, consistently, unhurriedly in the way she had asked for and he had provided, and which was, she had come to understand, the whole of what she had ever needed. Not management, not ceremony, just someone who stayed. She handed him the clippers. He looked at them. "The branch on the left," she said. "It needs to come off at the base." "I don't know how to." "I'll show you," she said. He took the clippers. She showed him. They worked in the cold morning garden while London woke up around the walls and the light came over the rooftops, and the roses, slowly and without drama, began to look like something that had been properly attended to. Which was, Margaret thought, exactly right. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.